Continuing Cassar from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. He was so much master of the goodwill and hearty service of his soldiers that those who, in other expeditions, were but ordinary men, displayed a courage past defeating or withstanding when they went upon any danger where Cassar's glory was concerned. Such a one was Achilles, who, in the sea fight before Marcellus, who had his right hand struck off with a sword. I wonder if that's where Marseille or Marquet, the city, comes from. Such another was Cassius Scava, who, in battle near Dyrrhachium, had one of his eyes shot out with an arrow, his shoulder pierced with one javelin, and his thigh with another, and having received 130 darts upon his target, called to the enemy as though he would surrender himself. But when two of them came up to him, he cut off the shoulder of one with a sword, and by a blow over the face forced the other to retire. Well, if you get cut clear off there, could he even survive? And so, with the assistance of his friends, who now came up, made his escape again in Britain, when some of the foremost officers had accidentally got into a morass full of water, and there were assaulted by the enemy, a common soldier, whilst Cassar stood and looked on, threw himself in the midst of them, and after many signal demonstrations of his valor, rescued the officers and beat off the barbarians. I don't like the use of that term for foreigners, but if it all it means is their speech is different, okay. He himself, in the end, took to the water, and with much difficulty, partly by swimming, partly by wading past it, but in the passage lost his shield. Cassar and his officers saw it and admired, and went to meet him with joy and acclamation. But the soldier, much dejected, in tears, threw himself down at Cassar's feet, and begged his pardon for having to let go his buckler. Another time in Africa, Scipio, having taken a ship of Cassar's in which Granius Petro, lately appointed quaestor, was sailing, gave the other passengers as free prize to his soldiers, but thought fit to offer the quaestor his life. But he said it was not usual for Caesars. People say Caesar. There's no Z. It's Sar, soldiers to take, but give mercy. And having said so, fell upon his sword and killed himself. Well, I mean, in Latin, it's Cassar. All these people killing themselves. What's don't do that. This love of honor and passion for distinction were inspired into them and cherished in them by Cassar himself, who by his unsparing distribution of money and honors showed them that he did not heap up wealth from the wars for his own luxury or for the gratifying his private pleasures, but that all he received was but a public fund laid by the reward and encouragement of valor, and that he looked upon all he gave to deserving soldiers as so much increase to his own riches. Added this also, there was no danger to which he did not willingly expose himself, no labor from which he pleaded an exemption. His contempt of danger was not so much wondered at by his soldiers, because they knew how much he coveted honor, but his enduring so much hardship, which he did to all appearance beyond his natural strength, very much astonished them, for he was a spare man, had a soft and white skin, was distempered in the head, and subject to an epilepsy, which, it is said, first seized him at Cordoba. That's in Spain, right? But he did not make the weakness of his constitution a pretext for ease, but rather used war as the best physic against indispositions, whilst by indefatigable journeys, coarse diet, frequent lodging in the field, and continual laborious exercise, he struggled with his diseases and fortified his body against all attacks. He slept generally in his chariots or litters, employing even his rest in pursuit of action. In the day he was thus carried by the forts, garrisons, and camps, one servant sitting with him, who used to write down what he dictated as he went, and a soldier attending behind him with his sword drawn. He drove so rapidly that when he first left Rome, he arrived at the river Rhone within 8 days. He had been an expert rider from his childhood, for it was usual with him to sit with his hands joined together behind his back, and so to put his horse to its full speed, and in this war he disciplined himself so far as to be able to dictate letters from on horseback, and to give directions to 2 who took notes. At the same time, or as Appius says to More, it is thought that he was the first who contrived means of communicating with friends by cipher, when either press of business or the large extent of the city left him no time for a personal conference about matters that required dispatch. Now, I guess in terms of secrecy among friends, maybe that was the first, but certainly as far as spiritually encoding things, at least from the profane, if not, leaving it as a layered mystery for an effect or something. Maybe, and among armies, certainly the cipher would have been a method that people used before that. But I'm not sure exactly what date someone within armies codes were used. How little nice he was in his diet may be seen in the following instance. Don't some of those Papua New Guinea tribes use codes? And some of the Native American tribes use that? When at the table of Valerius Leo, who entertained him at supper at Milan, a dish of asparagus was put before him, on which his host, instead of oil, had poured sweet ointment. Caesar partook of it without any disgust, and reprimanded his friends for finding fault with it. For it was enough, said he, not to eat what you did not like, but he who reflects on another man's want of breeding shows he wants it as much himself. Another time upon the road he was driven by a storm into a poor man's cottage, where he found but one room. Now asparagus is one of the more expensive vegetables, so people are like, a lot of people wouldn't shun it. They used to shun it if they were offered it, because, oh, someone's offering me something better than they have to. So, was cottage where he found but one room, and that such as would afford but a mean reception to a single person, and therefore took his companions places of honor, should be given up to the greater men, and necessary accommodations to the weaker, and accordingly ordered that Appius, who was in bad health, should lodge within, whilst he and the rest slept under a shed at the door. His first war in Gaul was against the Helvetians and Tigurini, who, having burnt their own towns, 12 in number, and 400 villages, would have marched forward through that part of Gaul which was included in the Roman province, as the Cimbrians and Teutons formerly had done. Nor were they inferior to those in courage, and in numbers they were equal, being in all 300,000, of which 190,000 were fighting men. Caesar did not engage the Tigurini in person, but Labienus, under his directions, routed them near the river Arar. The Helvetians surprised Caesar and unexpectedly set upon him as he was conducting his army to a Confederate town. He succeeded, however, in making his retreat into a strong position, where he had mustered and marshaled his men. His horse was brought to him, upon which he said, when I have won the battle, I will use my horse for the chase, but at present let me go against the enemy. and accordingly charged them on foot. After a long and severe combat, he drove the main army out of the field, but found the hardest work at their carriages and ramparts, where not only the men stood and fought, but the women also and children defended themselves till they were cut to pieces, insomuch that the fight was scarcely ended till midnight. This action, glorious in itself, Caesar crowned with another yet more noble, by gathering in a body all the barbarians that had escaped out of the battle, above 100,000 in number, and obliging them to reoccupy the country which they had deserted and the cities which they had burnt. Thus he did, for fear the Germans should pass it and possess themselves of the land, whilst it lay uninhabited. His second war was in defence of the Gauls against the Germans, though some time before he had made Ariovistus, their king, recognized at Rome as an ally, but they were very inseparable neighbors to those under his government, and it was probable, when occasion offered, they would renounce the present arrangements and march on to occupy Gaul, but finding his officers timorous, and especially those of the young nobility who came along with him in hopes of turning their campaignings with him into a means for their own pleasure or profit, he called them together and advised them to march off and not to run the hazard of a battle against their inclinations, since they had such weak, unmanly feelings, telling them that he would take only the 10th Legion and march against the barbarians, whom he did not expect to find an enemy more formidable than Cimbri, nor, he added, should they find him a general inferior to Marius. Upon this, the 10th Legion deputed some of their body to pay him their acknowledgments and thanks, and the other legions blamed their officers, and all, with great vigor and zeal, followed him many days' journey, till they encamped within 200 furlongs of the enemy. Ariovistus's courage, to some extent, was cooled in the very approach, for, never expecting the Romans would attack the Germans, whom he had thought it more likely they would not venture to withstand even in defense of their own subjects, he was the more surprised at Caesar's conduct, and saw his army to be in consternation, and they were still more discouraged by the prophecies of their holy women, who foretell the failure by observing the eddies of rivers and taking signs from the windings and noise of streams, who now warned them not to engage before the next new moon appeared. Caesar, having had intimation of this, and seeing the Germans lie still, though expedient to attack them whilst they were under these apprehensions, rather than sit still and wait their time, accordingly he has made his approaches to the strongholds and hills on which they lay encamped, and so galled and fretted them that at last they came down with great fury to engage, but he gained a signal victory and pursued them for 400 furlongs as far as the Rhine, all which space was covered with spoils and bodies of the slain. Ariovistus made shift to pass the Rhine with the small remains of an army, for it is said the number of the slain amounted to 80,000. After this action, Caesar left his army at their winter quarters in the country of Sequani, and, in order to attend the affairs at Rome, went into that part of Gaul which lies on the Po, and was part of the province, for the river Rubicon divides Gaul, which is on this side of the Alps, from the rest of Italy. There he sat down and employed himself in courting people's favor, great numbers coming to him continually, and always finding their request answered, for he never failed to dismiss all with present pledges of his kindness in hand, and further hopes for the failure. And during all this time of the war in Gaul, Pompey never observed how Caesar was on the one hand using the arms of Rome to effect his conquest, and on the other gaining over and securing to himself the favor of the Romans with the wealth which those conquests obtained him. But when he heard that Belgae, who were the most powerful of all the Gauls and inhabited a third part of the country, were revolted and had got together a great many thousand men in arms, he immediately set out and took his way hither with great expedition, and falling upon their enemy as they were ravaging the Gauls, his allies, he soon defeated and put to flight the largest and least scattered divisions of them, for though their numbers were great, yet they made but a slender defense, and the marshes and deep rivers were made passable to the Roman foot by the vast quantity of dead bodies. Of those who revolted, all the tribes that lived near the ocean came over without fighting, and he therefore led his army against the Nervii, the fiercest and most warlike people of all in those parts. These live in a country covered with continuous woods, and having lodged their children and property out of the way in the depth of the forest, fell upon Caesar with a body of 60,000 men before he was prepared for them. While he was making his encampment, they soon routed his cavalry, and having surrounded the 12th and 7th legions, killed all the officers. And had not Caesar himself snatched up a buckler and forced his way through his own men to come up to the barbarians? Or had not the 10th legion, when they saw him in danger, run in front of the tops of the hills, and where they lay, and broken through the enemy's ranks to rescue him? In all probability, not a Roman would have been saved. But now, under the influence of Caesar's bold statement, they fought a battle, as the phrase is, of more than human courage, and yet with their utmost efforts they were not able to drive the enemy out of the field, but cut them down fighting in their defense. For out of 60,000 men, it is stated that not above 500 survived the battle, and of 400 of their senators, not above 3. When the Roman Senate had received news of this, they voted sacrifices and festivals to the entities to be strictly observed for the space of 15 days. Now, is it daimon or theu? It matters, Daemon, deity. What do they mean when they say gods? Because in English we translate everything as gods, and you don't know whether it's an angel or a demon or what is it. Demon, daemon aren't quite the same thing, but to be strictly observed for the space of 15 days, a longer space than ever was observed for any victory before. The danger to which they had been exposed by the joint outbreak of such a number of nations was felt to have been great, and the people's fondness for Caesar gave additional luster to successes achieved by him. He now, after setting everything in Gaul, came back again and spent the winter by the Po in order to carry on the designs he had in hand at Rome. All who were candidates for offices used his assistance and were supplied with money from him to corrupt the people and buy their votes, in return of which, when they were chosen, they did all things in advance his power. But what was more considerable, the most eminent and powerful man in Rome, in great numbers, came to visit him at Lucca, Pompeii, and Crassus, and Appius, the governor of Sardinia, and Nepos, the proconsul of Spain, so that there were in the place at one time 120 lictors and more than 200 senators. In deliberation here held, it was determined that Pompey and Crassus should be consuls again for the following year, that Caesar should have a fresh supply of money, and that his command should be renewed to him for 5 years more. It seemed very extravagant to all thinking men that those very persons who had received so much money from Caesar should persuade the Senate to grant him more, as if he were in want, though in truth it was not so much upon persuasion as compulsion that, with sorrow and groans for their own acts, they passed the measure. Cato was not present, for they had sent him seasonably out of the way into Cuprus. But Cavanius, who was a zealous imitator of Cato, when he found he could do no good by opposing it, broke out of the house and loudly declaimed against these proceedings to the people, that none gave him any hearing, some slighting him out of respect to Crassus and Pompey, and the greater part to gratify Caesar, on whom depended their hopes. After this, Caesar returned again to his forces in Gaul, when he found that country involved in a dangerous war, two strong nations of the Germans having lately passed the Rhine to conquer it, one of them called the Asipes, the other the Tenterita of the war with the people. Chasar himself has given this account in his commentaries, that the barbarians, having sent ambassadors to treat with him, did during the treaty set upon him in his march, by which means with 800 men they routed 5,000 of his horse, who did not suspect their coming, that afterwards they sent other ambassadors to renew the same fraudulent practices, whom he kept in custody, and led on his army against the barbarians, as judging it mere simplicity to keep faith with those who had so faithlessly broken the terms they had agreed to. But Tanasius states that when the Senate decreed festivals and sacrifices for this victory, Cato declared it to be his opinion that Chasar ought to be given into the hands of the barbarians, so that the guilt which this breach of faith might otherwise bring upon the state might be expiated by transferring the curse on him who was the occasion of it. Of those who passed the Rhine, there were 400,000 cut off. Those few who escaped were sheltered by the Sugambri, a people of Germany. Chasar took hold of this pretense to invade the Germans, being at the same time ambitious of the honor of being the first man that should pass the Rhine with an army. He carried a bridge across it, though it was very wide, and the current at that particular point very full, strong and violent, bringing down with its waters trunks of trees and other lumber, which much shook and weakened the foundations of that bridge. But he drove great piles of wood at the bottom of the river above the passage, to catch and stop these as they floated down, and thus, fixing his bridle upon the stream, successfully finished his bridge, which no one who saw could believe to be the work of but 10 days. The passage of his army over it, he met with no opposition. The Suevi themselves, who are the most warlike people of all Germany, flying with their effects into the deepest and most densely wooded valleys, when he had burnt all the enemy's country, and encouraged those who had embraced the Roman interest, he went back into Gaul after 18 days' stay in Germany. But his expedition into Britain was the most famous testimony of his courage, for he was the first who brought a navy into the Western Ocean, or who sailed into the Atlantic with an army to make war, and by invading an island, the reported extent of which had made its existence a matter of controversy among historians, many of whom question whether it were not a mere name and fiction, not a real place. He might be said to have carried the Roman Empire beyond the limits of the known world. Now, myths don't always carry on entire truths, but the point is it's not the same thing as a fable. It's something with meaning and purpose. And sometimes you don't know what's a fable or not, right? So you understand some of that, because you're going to get burned if you just think that every story out there is completely true. Parts of it true, representing what's true, or good or whatever. But so when I say mythology, I'm not, religion is mythology, or it's a relationship to the facts, that there's purpose and meaning, and something that's not just history to relate history. He passed thither twice from that part of Gaul which lies over against it, and in several battles which he fought did more hurt to the enemy than service to himself, for the islanders were so miserably poor that they had nothing worth being plundered of, and when he found himself unable to put such an end to the war as he wished, he was content to take hostages from the king, and to impose a tribute, and then quitted the island. And on his arrival in Gaul, he found letters which lay ready to be conveyed over the water to him from his friends at Rome, announcing his daughter's death, who died in labor of a child by Pompey. Caesar and Pompey both were much afflicted with her death, nor were their friends less disturbed, believing that the alliance was now broken which had hitherto kept the sickly commonwealth in peace. For the child also died within a few days after the mother. The people took the body of Julia, in spite of the opposition of the tribunes, and carried it into the field of Mars, and there her funeral rites were performed, and her remains are laid. Caesar's army was now grown very numerous, so that he was forced to disperse them into various camps for their winter quarters, and he, having gone himself into Italy, as he used to do in his absence, a general outbreak throughout the whole of Gaul commenced, and large armies marched about the country, and attacked the Roman quarters, and attempted to make themselves masters of the forts where they lay. The greatest and strongest party of the rebels, under the command of Oryx, cut off Cotta and Titurius with all their men, while a force 6,000 strong besieged the legion under the command of Cicero, and had almost taken it by storm, the Roman soldiers being all wounded, and having quite spent themselves by a defense beyond their natural strength. But Caesar, who was at a great distance, having received the news, quickly got together 7,000 men, and hastening to relieve Cicero, the besiegers were aware of it, and went to meet him with great confidence that they should easily overpower such a handful of men. Caesar, to increase their presumption, seemed to avoid fighting, and still marched off till he found a place conveniently situated for a few to engage against many, where he encamped. He kept his soldiers from making any attack upon the enemy, and commanded them to raise the ramparts higher, and barricade the gates, that, by show of fear, they might heighten the enemy's contempt of them, till, at last, they came without any order in great security to make an assault, when he issued forth and put them in flight, with the loss of many men. This quieted the greater part of the commotions in these parts of Gaul, and Caesar, in the course of the winter, visited every part of the country with a great vigilance, took precautions against innovations. For there were 3 legions now come to him to supply the place of the men he had lost, of which Pompey furnished him with 2 out of those under his command. There was newly raised in the part of Gaul by the Po, but in a while the steeds of war, which had long since been secretly sown and scattered by the most powerful men in those warlike nations, broke forth into the greatest and most dangerous war that was in those parts, both as regards the number of men in the vigor of their youth, who were gathered and armed from all quarters, the vast funds of money collected to maintain it, the strength of the towns, and the difficulty of the country where it was carried on. It being winter, those rivers were frozen, the woods covered with snow, and the level country flooded, so that in some places the ways were lost through the deep of the snow, and others the overflowing of marshes and streams made every kind of passage uncertain, all which difficulties made it seem impracticable for Caesar to make any attempt upon the insurgents. Many tribes had revolted together, the chief of them being the Arverni and Carnutini. The general who had the supreme command in war was Vercingetorix, whose father the Gauls had put to death on suspicion of his aiming at absolute government. He, having disposed his army in several bodies and set officers over them, drew over to him all the country round about, as far as those that lie upon the Arar, and having intelligence of the opposition which Caesar now experienced at Rome, thought to engage all Gaul in the war, which if he had done a little later, when Caesar was taken up with the civil wars, Italy had been put into as great a terror as before it was by the Cimbri. Don't I talk about that in the Celtic series? But Caesar, who above all men was gifted with the faculty of making the right use of everything in war, and most especially of seizing the right moment, as soon as he heard of the revolt, returned immediately the same way he went, and showed the barbarians by the quickness of his march in such a severe season that an army was advancing against them which was invincible, for in the time that one would have thought it scarcely credible that a courier or express should have come with a message from him, he himself appeared with all his army, ravaging the country, reducing their posts, subduing their towns, receiving into his protection those who declared for him, till at last the Badai, who hitherto had styled themselves brethren to the Romans, and had been much honored by them, declared against him, and joined the rebels, to the great discouragement of his array. Accordingly he removed thence, and passed into the country of the Ligonus, desiring to reach the territories of Sequani, who were his friends, and who lay like a bulwark in front of Italy against other tribes of Gaul. There the enemy came upon him, and surrounded him with many myriads, whom he was also eager to engage, and at last, after some time, with much slaughter, gained, on the whole, a complete victory. Though at first he appears to have met with some reverse, the Aruveni show you a small sword hanging up in a temple, which they say was taken from Caesar. Caesar saw this afterwards himself, and smiled when his friends advised it should be taken down, would not permit it, because he looked upon it as consecrated. After the defeat, a great if it's a sacred object, you may not agree with whatever, but yeah, don't mess with people's temples. After the defeat, a great part of those who had escaped fled with their king into a town called Alesia, which Caesar besieged, though the height of the walls and the number of those who defended them made it appear impregnable, and meantime from without the walls he was assailed by greater danger than can be expressed, for the choice men of Gaul, picked out of each nation and well armed, came to relieve Alesia to the number of 300,000, nor were there in the town less than 170,000, so that Caesar, being shut up betwixt two such forces, was compelled to protect himself by two walls, one towards the town, the other against the relieving army, as knowing if these forces should join, his affairs would be entirely ruined. The danger that he underwent before Alesia justly gained him great honor on many accounts, and gave him an opportunity of showing greater instances of his valor and conduct than any other contest had done. One wonders how much he should be able to engage and defeat many thousands of men without the town, and not be perceived by those within, but yet more, that the Romans themselves who guarded their wall, which was next to the town, should be strangers to it, for even they knew nothing of the victory till they heard the cries of the men and lamentations of the women who were in the town, and had from thence seen the Romans at a distance carrying into their camp a great quantity of bucklers adorned with gold and silver, many breastplates stained with blood, besides cups and tents made in the Gallic fashion. So soon did so vast an army dissolve and vanish like a ghost or dream, the greatest part of them being killed upon the spot. Those who were in Alesia, having given themselves and Caesar much trouble, surrendered at last, and Vercingetorix, who was the chief spring of all the war, putting his best armor on and adorning his horse, rode out of the gates and made a turn about Caesar as he was sitting, and then quitting his horse, threw off his armor and remained quietly sitting at Caesar's feet until he was led away to be reserved for the triumph. Caesar had long ago resolved upon the overthrow of Pompey, as had Pompey, for that matter, upon his, for Crassus, the fear of whom had hitherto kept them in peace, having now been killed in Parthia. If the one of them wished to make himself the greatest man in Rome, he had only to overthrow the other. And if he wished to prevent his own fall, he had nothing for it but to be beforehand with him whom he feared. Yeah, there's something for putting your country first, rather than, this sectarian stuff. I mean, my country can't be that far off from that. Well, it's already gone too far. But